My family kicked me out. Years later, they begged for money, but I got the last laugh. Hello, read it. My name is Lucas Hayes, and at 16 years old, I learned what it meant to be disposable. I learned that family ties could be cut without warning, that loyalty was only expected from me, but never given in return, and that the people I was supposed to trust the most could turn their backs on me without hesitation. I learned that my existence in my parents' home had always been conditional, that I had been walking a tightrope my whole life without realizing that the safety net below me had never been there. The night they kicked me out, I stood on the front steps in the freezing autumn air, staring at the door that had just slammed shut in my face, and finally understood. They had never loved me the way they loved him. I had spent my entire life in my older brother Ryan's shadow. He was 2 years older, but it felt like decades separated us. Where he was charming, I was quiet. Where he was praised, I was overlooked. Where he was given endless patience and second chances, I was met with expectations, demands, and a growing sense that no matter what I did, I would never be enough. Ryan was the golden son, the untouchable one, the one who could do no wrong. And I was just the backup plan, the one who had to prove his worth at every turn, while Ryan simply had to exist to be adored. I had accepted it for most of my childhood. I had told myself that if I worked harder, if I achieved more, if I did everything right, maybe one day they would see me the way they saw him. Maybe one day I wouldn't feel like I was just filling space in their lives. But I never stood a chance. Ryan made sure of that. I still don't know why he did it. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was a power trip. Maybe he simply enjoyed knowing that he could manipulate the world around him with nothing but his words. But at some point, he decided that my life wasn't miserable enough. And so he started spinning lies. It was subtle at first. Small, seemingly harmless incidents. Money disappearing from my mother's purse, only for Ryan to find it in my backpack later. Missing jewelry showing up in my dresser drawer, planted so perfectly that when my mother found it, she didn't even need to ask how it got there. Comments slipped into conversations when he knew I wasn't around. Concerns about my behavior, about how I had been acting strange lately. Lies woven so carefully that they started to feel like truths. At first, I laughed it off. It was Ryan, my brother. My parents wouldn't actually believe him, right? They knew me. They knew I wasn't like that. But I underestimated him, because he knew exactly what he was doing. He started small, but once he realized how easy it was to plant doubt, he escalated. Suddenly, I was sneaking out at night. Suddenly, I was skipping school. Suddenly, I was hanging around bad influences. I would come home to cold stares and tense silences, to conversations that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. I would try to defend myself, only to be met with dismissive glances, with vague warnings to get my act together before it was too late. I hadn't done anything. I knew I hadn't done anything. But that didn't matter. Because in my parents' eyes, I wasn't their son anymore. I was a problem to be fixed. The final blow came on a night that, to this day, I still replay in my head, wondering if there was anything I could have said, anything I could have done to change the outcome. I came home late, not because I'd been out doing anything wrong, but because I had stayed at school working on a project. I walked through the door, expecting nothing more than the usual indifference. Instead, I found my parents sitting in the living room, their expressions unreadable, their bodies stiff. Ryan was there too, standing off to the side, his arms crossed, his face blank. I knew something was wrong before they even opened their mouths. My father's voice was firm, unwavering, as he told me they had made a decision. They had done everything they could for me. They had tried to set me on the right path. But I had been making bad choices, and they couldn't allow me to drag the family down any further. I had become a disruption in their home, and it was time for me to figure things out on my own. I stood there, frozen, my brain struggling to process what was happening. They were kicking me out, not grounding me, not punishing me. They were removing me. I tried to argue. I told them I hadn't done anything, that Ryan was lying, that this was insane. But they didn't want to hear it. My mother just shook her head, like I had let her down, like I had broken her heart. My father simply handed me a backpack, already packed with a few clothes and nothing else, and told me to leave. No money, no place to go, No second chances, just the doors slamming shut behind me. I stood outside in the cold, my breath visible in the crisp air, staring at the house I'd grown up in. My home, except it wasn't mine anymore. I thought they would come back. I thought, any second now, my mother would open the door, tears in her eyes, telling me they had changed their minds. That this was just a cruel lesson, a test, something to scare me straight. But the door never opened. I didn't know what to do. I had nowhere to go, no one to call. I walked for hours, trying to figure out a plan, but nothing made sense. I ended up at a bus stop, curling into myself for warmth, trying to convince myself that this wasn't real. But it was. By the second night, I stole a blanket from a donation bin behind a thrift store and found an alley to sleep in. By the third night, I had accepted that no one was coming for me. I wanted to cry, to break down, to let myself feel the betrayal that was clawing at my throat. But I couldn't, because this wasn't the end. If my parents thought I was going to disappear, if they thought I was going to let this break me, they were wrong. Because that was the night I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to be the forgotten son. I wasn't going to fade into nothing. I was going to survive. And one day, I was going to make sure they regretted ever throwing me away. When my parents shut that door, they expected me to vanish. They expected me to struggle, to fail, to come crawling back, desperate for their approval. Maybe they thought I'd beg for another chance, prove myself worthy of their love, accept whatever conditions they set just to be let back into their world. But they had underestimated me. The night they threw me away, they killed any part of me that still longed for their acceptance. I wasn't coming back. Not now. Not ever. I had nothing. No home, no money, no family who cared enough to take me in. But I had one thing. A refusal to be broken. I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to become the failure they had written me off as. I was going to build something from nothing, carve out a life so successful, so untouchable, that one day they would have no choice but to see what they had lost. The first year was hell. I spent weeks bouncing between shelters, learning which ones were safe, which ones weren't, how to keep my head down and avoid trouble. There was no room for pride when you had nothing. I ate at soup kitchens. I took whatever day labor jobs I could find. I slept wherever I could. Sometimes a shelter, sometimes a park bench, sometimes behind a gas station where the cameras didn't reach. I learned fast that people didn't look at you the same when you were homeless. It didn't matter that I was 16, that I had been thrown out through no fault of my own. The world didn't stop for people like me. If I wanted to get out, I had to fight for it. I scraped together what little money I could, but it was never enough. The jobs I managed to get paid barely anything, and without a permanent address, most places wouldn't even consider hiring me. The only thing that kept me going was the thought of proving them all wrong, of becoming something they couldn't ignore. Then, everything changed. It happened at a library of all places. One of the only places I could go during the day to stay warm, to kill time without being kicked out. I was sitting at a table, flipping through a newspaper I had no real interest in, when an older man sat down across from me. He was dressed well, nothing flashy, but the kind of polished appearance that told me he had money. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking, his voice calm, measured. He told me he had seen me coming into the library for weeks, always alone, always looking exhausted but never causing trouble. Then he asked me the question I had been dreading. "Are you homeless?" I wanted to lie, to brush him off, to pretend I had somewhere to go, that I wasn't just some stray kid barely holding it together. But I was too tired for pride. I nodded. He introduced himself as Robert Grayson, said he ran a local construction company, told me he wasn't offering a handout but a job, a real one, something steady, a way to get off the streets. I didn't trust it at first. People didn't just help for no reason. But he wasn't asking for anything in return. No conditions, no strings attached. He just gave me an address, told me to show up at 6 the next morning if I wanted work. I showed up. It was brutal. Hard labor, long hours, tasks I had no idea how to do. But I learned fast. I didn't complain, didn't slack off, didn't give them any reason to regret hiring me. Robert didn't treat me like a charity case. He expected me to work just as hard as everyone else. And for the first time in my life, someone saw potential in me instead of failure. That job saved me. With the money I earned, I got a cheap room in a rundown motel. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No more shelters, no more sleeping in the cold. I worked every shift they gave me, took every overtime opportunity, saved every dollar I could. Within a year, I had my own apartment, a tiny studio with peeling wallpaper and a leaky faucet, but it was mine. I enrolled in night classes, got my GED, kept pushing forward. By the time I turned 20, I had moved up in the company. I wasn't just another laborer anymore. I was learning the business, working my way towards something bigger. I took courses in business management, soaked up every lesson Robert was willing to teach me. And when he finally decided to retire, he made me an offer that changed my life. He wanted me to take over. I bought the company with everything I had, took what Robert had built and expanded it, turned it into something even bigger. By 25, I wasn't just stable, I was thriving. I had gone from a kid with nothing to a man who owned one of the fastest growing construction firms in the city. I had money, security, and a life I had built with my own two hands. I had done it. I had become everything they said I never would. And that was when they came back. It started with an email from my mother. A simple message, as if nothing had ever happened, as if years hadn't passed since the last time we had spoken. She wrote about how she had heard about my success, how proud she was of what I had accomplished, how family should always stick together. No mention of the night they threw me out. No epalegi, just carefully chosen words, leading up to the inevitable request. They needed help. My father had lost his job. Ryan had made some poor financial choices. Money was tight. They were struggling, and now, conveniently, they wanted to reconnect. I stared at the email for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, debating what to say. The anger was still there, the resentment, the years of pain that hadn't faded no matter how much I had accomplished. They hadn't cared if I lived or died. They hadn't reached out when I was sleeping on the streets, when I was fighting to survive. But now that I had money, now that I had built a life they could benefit from, suddenly I was family again. I could have ignored it, could have deleted the email and moved on. But that wasn't enough, because they had spent years believing I was nothing. And now, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I didn't respond to the email right away. In fact, I didn't respond at all. I let my mother's carefully worded "please sit in my inbox" unread after that first glance, as if ignoring it would somehow make the past disappear. But it didn't. It only made the anger fester. They had abandoned me. They had left me to rot, convinced I would fail, convinced I would disappear into nothing. And now, years later, they wanted to act like it had never happened, like they hadn't destroyed me and expected me to thank them for it. But I wasn't that broken 16-year-old anymore. I was Lucas Hayes, owner of a multi-million-dollar construction firm, a man who had built himself from the ground up. And if they thought I was going to roll over and give them what they wanted, they were about to be very disappointed. Weeks passed, and then more emails came. First from my mother, then from my father. At first, they were pleasant, dripping with fake warmth, pretending to be proud of me, pretending they cared. Then, when I didn't answer, the tone shifted. My father's messages became more direct. He wrote about how family should always support each other, how it was time to put the past behind us. My mother played the guilt card, claiming she prayed for me every day, that she had always believed in me, that they never meant to hurt me. And then, finally, Ryan reached out. I almost laughed when I saw his name appear in my inbox. If my parents had any lingering guilt about what they had done to me, Ryan certainly didn't. His email wasn't long, wasn't emotional. It was as smug as I remembered him being. He wrote that it was good to see I had finally made something of myself after my rebellious phase. As if I had run away. As if I hadn't been thrown out like trash. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize. Instead, he got straight to the point. He needed money. Ryan had made some bad investments. He had started a business that went under. He was in debt, and he expected me, the brother he had framed and destroyed, to bail him out. He wrote as if it were a foregone conclusion, as if I owed him something, as if this was just how things worked. I stared at the email for a long time, feeling nothing but an icy detachment. They had cut me out of their lives, and now that they needed something, they expected me to fix their mess. It was almost laughable. They didn't see me as a son or a brother. They saw me as a bank, a resource, a second chance at comfort. and I was going to teach them exactly what it felt like to be discarded. Instead of responding, I made a decision. If they wanted to talk, they were going to have to do it on my terms. I drafted an email to my mother, short and to the point. If you want to see me, let's meet in person. Dinner. I'll send the details. Just you and Dad. No Ryan. I didn't expect them to agree so easily, but they did. Desperation had made them eager. They wanted access to me, and they were willing to play by my rules, at least for now. I chose a high-end restaurant, one that required reservations weeks in advance, one that they had likely never stepped foot in before. It was an undeniable display of power, of the distance between who I had become and who they had left behind. The night of the dinner, I arrived early. I had chosen a table in the center of the restaurant, where everyone could see. When my parents walked in, I saw them hesitate at the entrance, scanning the room until their eyes landed on me. My mother's face lit up with something that almost looked like relief. My father's expression was more reserved, unreadable. They both looked older than I remembered, more worn down, as if the years had not been kind to them. For a moment, I almost felt something close to pity. Almost. Then, they reached my table, and my mother wasted no time. She tried to hug me, acting as if we were long-lost family, finally reunited after years of misunderstanding. I let her arms hover before I leaned back in my chair, making it clear I wasn't interested. The rejection hit her hard. I saw it in the way her lips pressed together, the way she hesitated before sitting down across from me. My father followed, his gaze heavy with unspoken expectations. The conversation started civilly, almost too polite, the kind of small talk that was meant to ease me into whatever they were planning to ask. My mother complimented the restaurant. My father asked about my business. They acted like parents catching up with their successful son, like they had been there for the journey, like they had a right to share in what I had built. And then the moment came. My father cleared his throat, leaning forward, his expression serious but practiced. He told me that they were struggling, that Ryan had made mistakes, that things weren't easy for them. He spoke as if he was laying out facts, as if he expected me to nod and agree, as if this was inevitable. Then he said it. He told me that it was time for me to do the right thing and help my family. I almost laughed. Instead, I leaned back, took a sip of my drink, and let the silence stretch between us. Then I spoke. I reminded them of the night they had thrown me out, of the cold, of the nights I spent sleeping on the streets, of the years I'd spent clawing my way up with no help, no safety net, no one looking for me. I described in detail what it felt like to be abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me. I told them how for years I had waited for them to reach out, to fix what they had broken, to at least acknowledge what they had done. But they never had. I watched as my mother's face crumbled, as my father shifted uncomfortably, as they realized this wasn't going the way they had hoped. My mother started to speak, but I cut her off. I told them that family had never meant anything to them when I needed it, that the only reason they were sitting here now was because they wanted something, that if I had failed, if I had become what they expected me to be, they wouldn't have cared. They wouldn't have searched for me. They wouldn't have needed me. And then I gave them my answer. No, I wasn't giving them a cent. No, I wasn't bailing Ryan out. No, I wasn't going to pretend the past never happened. They had thrown me away, and now I was returning the favor. I stood, placed a few bills on the table, not for them, but for the meal I had ordered, and walked away without another word. I didn't turn back. I didn't need to. I knew what I had left behind. By the time I got home, I had a new email waiting for me. This one wasn't from my parents. It was from Ryan, and something told me that this wasn't over yet. I knew Ryan wouldn't stay silent for long. He never did. He was too proud, too entitled, too convinced that the world owed him something to simply accept my refusal. So when his name appeared in my inbox, I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was the tone of his message. It wasn't smug. It wasn't manipulative. It wasn't another demand wrapped in fake brotherly warmth. It was short, clipped, almost desperate. He wanted to meet. In person. For a moment, I considered deleting the email and moving on with my life. I had nothing left to say to him. He had spent years tearing me down, spreading lies, making sure I was thrown out of my own home. He had sat back and watched as I suffered, knowing full well what he had done, and he had never once regretted it. And now, because he had finally hit rock bottom, I was supposed to listen? But something didn't sit right. Ryan was a lot of things, manipulative, arrogant, selfish, but he wasn't stupid. He knew I wanted nothing to do with him. He had to know I had no reason to help him. So why was he reaching out now? And why did he sound like he had no other options? Curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to meet him, but only on my terms. A public place, middle of the afternoon, somewhere I could leave if things went sideways. We settled on a cafe downtown. I wasn't expecting much, probably another pathetic attempt at guilt-tripping me into handing over cash. But when I walked in and saw him, I realized something was different. Ryan looked terrible, not just stressed, not just tired, but wrecked. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his once-groomed hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there before. I had never seen him like this. Ryan had always been effortlessly put together, always carrying himself like the world belonged to him. But now, he looked like a man who had lost everything. I sat down across from him and waited. For a few seconds, he just stared at me, as if trying to find the right words. And then, to my complete shock, he apologized. Not a half-hearted, empty apology. Not some manipulative attempt to rewrite history. He actually admitted what he had done. He told me he had lied about me when we were younger, that he had spread rumors because he had been jealous, because he had liked watching my parents turn against me, because he had wanted me gone. He told me he had been cruel, that he had never expected things to go as far as they had, that when he realized our parents were actually going to throw me out, he hadn't known how to stop it. And then he told me the truth. He wasn't in trouble just because of bad business decisions. He was in trouble because he had borrowed money from the wrong people. Ryan had gotten involved with a loan shark, convinced he could flip the money into a profitable investment. But when his business failed, he hadn't been able to pay it back. And now, they weren't just demanding repayment. They were threatening him. He had been given a deadline. If he didn't pay back what he owed, things are going to get ugly. That's why our parents had reached out. That's why they had suddenly wanted to reconnect. They weren't just in financial trouble. They were scared. They had realized their golden son wasn't so golden anymore, and now they were grasping at straws, hoping I would be their way out. I let his words settle, waiting for the inevitable request. Sure enough, Ryan finally met my eyes and asked me for help. He didn't even try to make it sound like anything else. He just admitted that he needed money, a lot of money, and that I was the only one who could save him. He told me he understood if I hated him, if I never wanted to see him again, but that if I didn't help him, he was going to die. And for the first time since I had sat down, I believed him. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. It would have been so easy to walk away, to leave him to deal with the mess he had made. After all, this was his fault. He had been cruel, selfish, reckless. He had betrayed me, ruined my life, and never once looked back. He deserved to face the consequences. But as much as I hated him, I wasn't him. I wasn't the kind of person who could sit back and watch someone suffer, no matter how much they deserved it. So I made a decision. I told him I would help, but not the way he wanted. I wasn't handing him money. I wasn't giving him a blank check to make this problem disappear. If he wanted my help, he was going to do things my way. At first, he hesitated. He had never taken orders from me before. But desperation made him agree. I had already built connections through my company, people who dealt with high-risk financial cases, people who had experience handling dangerous situations. Within hours, I had them looking into Ryan's debt, into the people he owed, into how deep the hole really was. And what they found made my blood run cold. It was worse than I had thought. Ryan hadn't just borrowed money. He had been set up. The loan shark who had given him the money wasn't just some random criminal. He had targeted Ryan on purpose. He had known exactly who Ryan was, exactly who our family was. And he had assumed that, no matter how much Ryan lost, there would always be someone willing to bail him out. That someone was supposed to be me. The entire scheme had been designed to trap me into paying. Ryan had been nothing more than bait, a reckless idiot who had walked straight into the snare. And now, I was being dragged into it, whether I wanted to be or not. I met with Ryan again the next day, and when I laid it all out for him, I saw the realization hit him like a freight train. He had been played. He had been used. just like he had once used me. For the first time in his life, Ryan wasn't the one in control. I told him that if he wanted to survive this, he was going to have to trust me completely. No more secrets, no more lies, no more cutting corners. He agreed, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. And so, I started putting the pieces in place. I contacted the right people, used the power I had built over the years to find a way out of this mess. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But I would fix it. Not for Ryan. Not for my parents. For me. Because if they thought they could manipulate me into being their savior, if they thought they could throw me away and then pull me back in when it suited them, they were about to learn a very painful lesson. I was going to save Ryan. But when this was over, I was going to make sure none of them ever had power over me again. For the first time in his life, Ryan was powerless. The realization had finally sunk in. He wasn't the one pulling the strings this time. He wasn't the manipulator, the golden son, the favored child who could twist reality to his advantage. He was a pawn. And worse, he had been played just like he had played me years ago. The debt he owed wasn't just money. It was a noose around his neck, held by people who didn't make empty threats. He had been reckless, arrogant, thinking he could outsmart criminals the same way he had outsmarted our parents, our teachers, and me. But these weren't people who could be manipulated. They couldn't forgive. And now, he was staring down consequences he had no way of escaping. Unless I saved him, the old Lucas would have walked away. The 16-year-old version of me, the one who had stood outside our family home with nothing but a backpack and betrayal in his gut, would have left him to rot. And maybe in another life I would have. But I wasn't doing this for Ryan. I wasn't doing it for my parents. I was doing it because I wanted control. I wanted power. I wanted to make sure that when this was over, they would never be able to touch my life again. So I set my plan in motion. I didn't just pay off Ryan's debt. I dismantled it. Through my company, I had built relationships with powerful people, people who knew how to make problems disappear. I reached out to the right contacts, sent the right messages, and within a few days, I had everything I needed to turn the tables. The man Ryan had borrowed from, the so-called loan shark, wasn't as untouchable as he thought. His operation had threads I could pull, weak spots I could exploit. I made it very clear, if anything happened to Ryan, if they even thought about coming after me, I would make sure their entire business collapsed. I had resources. I had money. And more importantly, I had leverage. I had quietly acquired enough dirt on them to make their lives very difficult. It was a calculated risk, but it worked. Ryan's debt, gone. The threats, erased. But the consequences for him, just beginning. I didn't tell him immediately. I let him sit with his fear for a little while longer. Let him feel what it was like to be helpless. When I finally told him it was over, that he was free, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Gratitude and fear, because he finally understood. He knew that, in a single move, I had done what our parents never could. I had saved him. And not because I was weak, or because I was desperate for their approval, but because I had won. But my revenge wasn't complete. Once Ryan was safe, I cut him off. Completely. I made it clear he would never contact me again. He would never ask me for another favor. He would never be a part of my life. I didn't care if he begged. I didn't care if he swore he had changed. He had already proven exactly who he was, and now that his crisis was over, I was done with him. And then, I turned my attention to our parents. They had waited, watching from the sidelines, hoping I would fix everything, hoping I would be the solution to their precious son's mistakes. And I had been, but not for them. When they reached out again, because of course, they did, I finally responded. I sent them a message, short and to the point. Ryan is safe. The debt is gone. You will never hear from me again. And then I blocked them. I didn't wait for their response. I didn't care what they had to say. I had given them mercy, something they had never given me, but I wasn't going to give them access to my life. I had built myself without them. I had risen from nothing without their love, their support, their guidance. I had made something of myself despite them, not because of them, and now they had to live with that. They had thrown me away, believing I would disappear. Instead, I became someone they could never reach again. Ryan had his second chance. My parents had their closure. But I had something much more valuable. Freedom. And that, more than anything, was the greatest revenge of all.